So as you can see, the CAPS pandemic was catastrophic. And as we've said, the impact of a severe pandemic is not only a result of the disease itself, but really the cascading economic and societal consequences that would follow. Now, we don't want to give you the impression that traditional public health measures aren't valuable, because they absolutely are. In fact, in the 200-some outbreaks that WHO responds to each year, interventions such as isolation of the sick, social distancing, disease surveillance, really do help to interrupt the spread of disease and control epidemics before they become pandemics. But in a severe, fast-moving pandemic, it may not be possible to contain the spread through these kinds of traditional measures. And as we saw in the scenario, there's a limit to what government, NGOs, and global business can do on the fly to stop a widespread and lethal pandemic. That's why prior planning and promotion of routine public-private cooperation in advance of the next pandemic is really critical. So you dealt with four serious international policy challenges today, but in an actual pandemic, there would be many more. In the exercise, the board wrestled with a series of very difficult problems, and you did a terrific job with no ability to prepare and a really fast-paced and complex set of issues. But assuming we do have a few years to prepare, what should we do to prevent this from becoming a reality? In advance of the exercise today, we drafted a list of actions that we think would start to move us in the right direction. And now that you participated in the exercise, we really want to seek your input on other things we could do to be better prepared. Our initial suggestions are these. First, global business should recognize the economic burden of pandemics and really fight for stronger preparedness. Business leaders and their shareholders could actively engage with governments and advocate for increased resources for pandemic preparedness. Second, governments and businesses should plan now for how corporate capabilities could be used for a large-scale pandemic. Industry assets, if swiftly and appropriately deployed, really could help to save lives and reduce economic losses. So governments could work now to identify the most critical areas of need and reach out to industry players with the goal of finalizing agreements in advance of a large pandemic. Third, we think industry and national governments should work with WHO to enhance internationally held stockpiles of MCMs and personal protective equipment so that it could be equitably distributed during a large pandemic. The WHO's existing influenza vaccine virtual stockpile is a good model that could be expanded and augment WHO's ability to distribute vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, other PPE to countries in the greatest need. Countries that would have to support this effort through the provision of additional funding to WHO. Fourth, countries and global transportation companies, we believe, should work together to maintain travel and trade during a severe pandemic. I think you all agreed that travel and trade are essential to the global economy as well as to national and local economies, and they need to be maintained. But public-private cooperation is necessary in order to explore potential solutions to that really difficult problem. Fifth, governments should provide more resources and support for the development of surge manufacturing of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Countries may need population-level supplies of safe and effective MCMs in a pandemic. So we're therefore really going to have the need to rapidly develop, manufacture, distribute, and dispense large quantities of MCMs. Countries with enough resources should make this more of a priority than they do today. Sixth, we should increase and reassess pandemic financial support. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, regional development banks, national governments, and foundations should explore ways to increase the availability of funds in a pandemic and ensure that they could be flexibly used when they're needed. And finally, governments in the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation related to pandemic.
More simulations, I think particularly doing them in places where decisions will get made locally at local public health authorities. I think particularly in urban areas, as we saw in this, it spread quickly in megacities first. And I think as it spread to other regions, some of the regional economic communities in East and Southern Africa, West Africa, I think those simulations will be important with the people who will actually be making those decisions. But I wanted to build on Jane's comment about the research and development enterprise, because I think it highlights another gap. I do think we need to put more financing into things like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation to prepare as their strategy is for things we can predict, MERS, Ebola, other things that we know are coming, Nipah. But I think, like we saw in this scenario, there will be emergence of pathogens we can't predict. So we have to really work at disease X, or CAPS. Platforms that can be rapidly mobilized using reverse vaccinology. I think we have to go beyond vaccines to other countermeasures, diagnostics, et cetera. And there, one of the stumbling blocks has been, and I think George was getting at this, the rapid sharing of information, particularly gene sequencing information. Often countries are reluctant to share samples or sequence information because they're concerned about the distributive justice. If we contribute to the science, will we benefit from the science? And I think, as Mike referred to in the opening video, we have a partial solution for that in the pandemic influenza area through the PIP. But we need to expand that to other potential pathogens so that in the event of a fast-moving pandemic, countries don't hesitate to share the information that will be vital for science to do its job and develop countermeasures, and they won't hesitate because they'll know they'll also benefit. And that regime doesn't exist yet. And whether we approach it through the World Health Assembly, build on the international health regulations, we need to have that in place ahead of time, because establishing that kind of trust in the face of a fast-moving pandemic is even harder to do.
And just to add to that, to be completely clear, it took us years to negotiate the PIP framework. I actually chaired the Intergovernmental Working Relationship meeting that did that. And that was when one country lost confidence in the global virus sharing mechanism, chose not to share, and it took us years to rebuild that trust and that confidence. And I would argue it's not completely there yet.
Just like to observe that there's a convergence of the two ideas that we've just heard. I think if there's confidence among countries that the governance and the sharing exists and that it can be relied upon, there'll be a greater willingness to share samples and information. So I think those two things really fit together.
And we have to keep the awareness alive, and it's our responsibility to do this and to do simulations, to do actions, to recommend actions like this. But I know exactly what happens when I go home to Zurich and when I talk about this next week in my company. They will tell me, yes, we know, but there are other daily businesses to do. And I think we have to keep this alive. We all know that there is Ebola right now.
Take away from the discussion is the need for greater community